Okay, welcome back. It's an interview special today, and with the devastating news, in fact, earth-shattering news of the return of perhaps the greatest political colossus of our times to frontbench politics, according to Ian Dale, Conservative commentator, if you're not familiar with him, Daddy's Home, though I'm not quite sure what triggered this emotional response from Mr. Dale. Perhaps our guest today, James Hay-Smith of the Popular Pod, can shed some light on the joy felt by certain areas of the centrist dad community at the return of David Cameron. James, welcome back to the program.
Absolute delight to be back with you, Brother Alexander. This is like when David Bowie joined Arcade Fire on stage in the 2000s. It's as big as that.
Very appropriate reference, given that we are now in a 2000s revival. And this is how old we are now getting. Everything's being revived. I might have to dig out my Arctic Monkeys CD collection just to go along with this moment.
Yes, man. Well, it's a strange one. It's one of those kind of really disconcerting moments where everyone has been on some kind of crazy political journey since 2010 when David Cameron became Prime Minister. 2016 when he resigned after the Brexit referendum. So to suddenly see him back on our screens, I'm taken back to where I was. A big part, it's pretty typical for people on the left or broader kind of dissident community to cite the Iraq War as their big politicizing moment. And I feel like that would be the dignified answer. But for me, the real hate, the real personal stuff comes from David Cameron and that coalition government. I think more than anything that set me on my political course. So it's dredging up this weird archive of negativity. It's also amazing to see, as you say, the centrist dad celebrations for this return to what any idiot can see is the Prime Minister who sowed the seeds of the destruction of their whole ideology and the legitimacy of their entire project. And then the other sort of uncanny angle of this is realizing that David Cameron is 4 years younger than Keir Starmer. So what feels like this revenant from the past, this spectre, this decaying fist punching up out of the graveyard soil, actually he's younger than the guy who we expect to become Prime Minister next year.
Well, it's an extraordinary move from Rishi Sunak. It's almost an admission that his government has no purpose to its existence whatsoever, and that he, as an apparent prime minister, has no real authority, it would seem, because he was, as Suella Braverman's rather, shall we say, spicy resignation, but acknowledgement of sacking letter, which I have here, was making plain, he wasn't the candidate of anybody. He was appointed essentially by the Whitehall machine, really, and the grey men in grey suits who called the tune in the Conservative Party. So he has no legitimacy. He has done exceedingly little other than just exist in place. And now he calls back a man who never was popular outside of certain broadsheet journalists' offices, and maybe like certain elements of the BBC, like Nick Robinson was very happy to see him back, for instance. And I other than like some payoff, for instance, I can't see what this does for the actual Conservative Party, other than compound their crisis that they're already in, where you've got the right clustering around Suella and the rest of them calling the right of their own party fascist, which they always used to do in private. They're not supposed to do it in public. So I really can't see what move this is for the Conservative Party itself, other than like putting someone with a bit more experience in a big role so he can basically run things as they sort of head towards what they all regard as an inevitable defeat.
We live in a time of spiders being swallowed to catch flies. Boris Johnson was only permitted to become Tory leader and Prime Minister because the Tory party machine and the wider media apparatus realised that Theresa May was not going to beat Jeremy Corbyn. That 2017 freak rupture upset so many expectations about where politics was that the Tory party and the broader sort of blob realised that they needed to bring in someone who they found pretty unpalatable in order to make sure that Corbyn, however milquetoast I know you always regarded him, they wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. You go back to 2016 and David Cameron's resignation, it looked like Boris Johnson, all Tory supporters thought that Boris Johnson was going to inherit the throne. He, after all, had headed up the Brexit, the pro-Brexit campaign. Backroom deals shafted Boris and brought Theresa May in. When they realised that that was a bad decision, they allowed Boris in. With Corbyn gone, they didn't need Boris anymore and were basically embarrassed of him. And that is why we've ended up with Rishi Sunak. And we also live in a time of impunity. The sort of revenge for the populist experiments on the right and left, the attempts to re-energize democracy and roll back the post-political situation that we'd been in through the neoliberal decades. That long 2016 is well and truly back in the box, and the centrist zombies of either party can now do whatever they want. They can act with impunity. They can, in the Labour Party, introduce an anti-Semitism disciplinary policy that results in far more Jews being kicked out of the Labour Party than it does Gentiles. And on the Tory side, they're perfectly happy to bring back the guy whose entire political reputation was trounced. He bet everything on his ability to deliver for Remain in the referendum, a referendum that he didn't ever even have to call. It was sheer arrogance on Cameron's part that we've even left the European Union, the centrist project can now essentially do what it wants unopposed, whether it's Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. It makes very little difference to their interests. And so why not spice things up? Why not excite people a little bit with the return of David Cameron, people in the political media class anyway? It sure beats talking about the images that we're all seeing of thousands of Palestinian children being blown up or left to die in unplugged life support machines in hospitals.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it's an obvious choice for Rishi, really. You have several days of people talking about, well, what does this mean, rather than Rishi's enthusiastic endorsement of Benjamin Netanyahu on his rampage around the Gaza Strip. So, I mean, David Cameron will probably undoubtedly approve of all of this, but it's a few days without that being on the front page, and it's a few days perhaps without him having to look at so many Daily Express editorials declaring that Suella Braverman should be Prime Minister, perhaps with Tommy Robinson as Deputy Prime Minister. I'm not sure. But talking of the dead hand of centrism, James, you have written an article which I found quite interesting for Compact Magazine. It's out today on the website, I believe, in which you examine the next man in line for the poison chalice, perhaps, Sir Keir Starmer. It's very important to give him his title, given he's done an awful lot to earn it over the years in loyal service. So the case you make in the article, James, is that basically this, as you've already implied, this Keir Starmer is the anti-populist in many respects, given that his entire 3 years now, or 3.5 years, in fact, how time flies, at the top of the Labour Party, have been about essentially reassuring every single key group in the British ruling class and political establishment that he's their guy and nothing will fundamentally change. And so he is a completely uninspiring figure He's, to use Tariq Ali's phrase, I believe, is like the perfect representative of the extreme centre, because he appears to stand for nothing. But in actual fact, that nothing itself is quite a monstrous prospect, isn't it?
It absolutely is. As a recovering Corbynista, it pains me to say anything that might be interpreted as positive about the Labour Party, but I think it is worth stressing, in a time when people kind of either celebrate or criticise Keir Starmer as a return to Blairism. Actually, I think it's really important to grasp that this nothing, this non-entity of Sir Keir is actually a pretty profound and significant departure from the entire history of the Labour Party. Every major advance, electoral advance, that the Labour Party has managed in its entire history has arrived with a rhetoric, at least, usually short-lived, of progressivism, of a kind of grasping of the future, and a sort of defiance. If we just think of what kind of little soundbite or cliche each of those advances in its history are associated with in the public imagination, let's run through them. 1945 is always the creation of the NHS. 1964 is always the Harold Wilson talking about the white heat of technology, this kind of futuristic vision of Britain unshackled from the kind of idiotic establishment. Flash forward to 1997, and it's things can only get better. 2017, well, take your pick. It's Jeremy Corbyn, Jez we can, for the many, not the few. By contrast, when Keir Starmer wins what is predicted to be a huge landslide next year, whatever progressive, positive platitudes we might hear between now and then, whatever Ian Dale might come up with to claim to be excited about Keir Starmer, what that victory will really be owing to is what I've described as the most extraordinary piece of political performance art, which is that Starmer started by saying he was essentially going to do the 2017 manifesto. This is how you win over the lovely, sweet people in the Labour Party. You tell them what they want to hear. Don't worry about my record. Don't worry about my entire ideology. Don't worry about the people I hang out with and work with and I'm funded by. I promise I'm going to do the things that you want me to do. So he started with this ambitious program of, transforming the country on the lines that Corbyn proposed. And then every few months, he drops one of those policies. It's a sort of water torture thing of these kind of this drip of actually, I'm not going to do that. Actually, I'm not going to do that. Actually, I'm not going to do that. That has run simultaneously. It's like some sort of, video installation where we've got these two screens and we're sort of there on a school trip to the art gallery watching them. The other screen is what I call this game of reactionary chicken, where the Conservative government comes up with some absurd, unpracticable, reactionary idea. We're going to start sending, criminals to Rwanda. We're going to ignore every law on the statute book. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And Keir Starmer, instead of making any critique or opposition or ideological differentiation between himself and the government, he simply says, whatever they said they're going to do, I'm going to do it too, but with more technocratic managerial expertise. So I don't know. It's an appalling political state to be in. It's heartbreaking for those of us who really embraced the idea that actually it was a good thing that the Conservative Party was being more right-wing and the Labour Party was being more left-wing, and that Brexit was this kind of huge, potentially democratizing exercise. For those of us who celebrated that and saw in the long 2016 real potential for some kind of political rebirth, it's obviously disappointing to say the least, but nonetheless it is rather impressive how Starmer has pulled it off, and it marks him as different from every previous Labour leader who's managed a big electoral advance, or managed to say it's the Labour Party's turn to manage capitalism for a little bit. And I claim that this is what makes Starmer the perfect politician for our moment. We are living in a time when all of that promising that went on in those populist years, all of that aspiration to kind of break from capitalist realism, break from this increasing kind of economic doomerism that we can't have nice things, we can't improve our countries, we can't have universalist projects, we can't grab people by the pussy anymore if you're on the Trump side of things. All of that kind of big promising that went on across the political spectrum has now switched gear, and instead we're living in a time when actually governments are, again, with impunity, basically just fessing up to managed decline. They are driving us into massive seismic policies, unprecedented approaches to foreign policy, unprecedented approaches to domestic policy. Think of lockdown, think of Ukraine. And they're saying, yeah, doing these is going to cause inflation. Doing these is going to crash our economies. Doing these is going to completely overturn our access to natural resources and energy in Europe. But we're going to do them anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I claim that that Starmer's performance art of negative political non-promising is actually the perfect kind of political rhetoric and approach to the way that all of our governments in the West essentially are behaving right now.
Well, he's certainly perfected the art of saying nothing and promising even less. I mean, as you say, like he promised initially to be Corbynism without Corbyn, which I think is a phrase of Paul Mason's originally, or certainly he's one of the originators of it, and that should give you an idea of where this is coming from. But like as you say in the article, his career would give you a fairly good indication of where he's coming from, given that you don't get to be head of the Crown Prosecution Service without being a very deeply embedded and trusted British deep state operative for a long time. And you point out in the article that he was very keen on aligning the British legal system with the American system when it came to not just the war on terror, but the war on drugs as well. So he was a very reactionary prosecutor for his time, for the entirety of his time in office. His record on things like the Julian Assange issue, where he is very heavily implicated in what has happened to Assange, and no one, as far as I can see, has, outside of a few independent journalists, has ever tried even to ask him about this. It's never even come up. But this man's whole career is as of like a complete reactionary, and yet he was able to get away with spinning himself as some sort of progressive figure, like as and many on the softer end of the left fell for this because he was Mr. Remain, he was Mr. Second Referendum. And I think that points to an enormous blind spot of that element of the Corbyn left, who fell for the second referendum nonsense, believing that Brexit was the coming of the British Reich, and enabled this man, who is a very creepy sort of character out of a Le Carré novel, basically, to rise to the top by waving an EU flag and telling them lies, basically.
It's treated as a mystery that Sir Keir could go from being a progressive hero in the 1990s and at the turn of the century, who was part of the McLibel case team defending environmental protesters against McDonald's, a libel case by McDonald's. He was part of the campaign against capital punishment, helping people who were on death row internationally. He was instrumental in kind of making the legal case for Britain's adoption of the European Convention on Human Rights under New Labour, and he also laid out the legal case against the Iraq War. That record kind of supersedes what he then did as Director of Public Prosecutions, the kind of reactionary stuff that you've just been describing, for a lot of liberals and leftists of a certain age. They remember that stuff and not what he did more quietly next. Others who do know about both sides of Starmer's career might either make excuses and say, but he came back to his roots by becoming a Labour MP, serving under Corbyn, defending the great liberal left project of the European Union. But I think actually that what we need to do is to understand the consistent line that goes through those apparent sort of two faces of Keir Starmer. I don't really see a break there at all. The consistency is that when he was some kind of socialist, when he was some kind of left-leaning liberal, it was always from above. However sincere or otherwise, its whole kind of theory of progress, liberation, doing the right thing, whatever it is, was always coming from above. And in fact, if you look up his early writings in that venerable organ socialist lawyer, you find him in the early 90s arguing that actually the left needs to move away from trade unions and activism and instead take on a kind of lawfare approach, a constitutional approach. So, in other words, the Starmer who thinks that the left doesn't need direct action, doesn't need trade unionism, doesn't need activism in the early 90s, and instead can rely on the from above machinations of an expert class, a lawyer class, and getting the ear of government, is also the Sir Keir who's perfectly happy to lock up, to extradite, and to defend people who've spied on, or if we're talking about the spy cops cases, enacted what I would call state rape against protesters when he becomes director of public prosecutions. It's not an unusual story that somebody who begins as a Trotskyist and has a great sort of suspicion of the agency of the working class and its institutions in their early kind of left-wing radicalism will go on to think that they can dispatch all those things once they get into a position of authority. So actually what we're talking about is somebody whose entire ideology is, trust me, I'm the expert and I will do the right thing from above. And when protesters, activists, left-wing institutions way of that, anything will excuse, anything can be excused that could be done against them.
So in a strange way, your old associate who you've had on the program, Peter Hitchens, he's actually right in some senses then, which is yes. that there is a consistency from Pabloite Trotskyism through to being Knight of the Realm, head lawyer in the Crown Prosecution Service and leader of the Labour Party. Then in that sense, there is a consistent line. That's what you're arguing?
Absolutely right. And, let's invoke those nice people in the Labour Party again. A lot of those will be thinking, okay, Starmer is bad. I disapprove of the fact he's kicked Corbyn out of the party and done all these, dropped all these good policies and done all these things that I disapprove of. But isn't he ultimately the lesser of two evils? Isn't any Labour government preferable to a Tory government? But actually, I certainly think that we do have to listen to commentators like Peter Hitchens here when they say that actually the left is often, the so-called left party, is often in a position to enact forms of degradation on the stage that the right just doesn't have access to. When Margaret Thatcher said that Tony Blair was her greatest achievement, she wasn't lying, because the point is that even if it seemed like some things were preferable under New Labour to what they had been like under the previous Tory regimes, and no one can deny that from the point of view of using hospitals and schools and other forms of public services. Nonetheless, Blair and Blairism were able to enact forms of authoritarianism and commodification on Britain that Major and Thatcher were unable to do. Only Blair could dig into the natural monopolies of health and higher education and welfare in the way that he did. A Tory government just wouldn't have been permitted to enact those revolutions of imposing artificially an internal market in all of those areas. Okay, spending was higher under New Labour, but it came with the price tag of a kind of neoliberal breakup of any kind of sense in which those institutions were really answerable to democratically elected governments anymore, and they became all the more easy to sell off under David Cameron. In foreign policy, Tony Blair was far more Atlanticist than any previous Prime Minister, Labour or Tory, and the way in which he dissolved any sense of Britain having an independent foreign policy in the waters of the Atlantic has sort of been forgotten, really. Every previous prime minister had some kind of area of foreign policy that they kept away from the Americans. So I would look to Starmer and predict that if New Labour anything to go by, a right-wing Labour government is able to do things and take things further than a Tory government is capable of. It's not a case of the lesser of two evils. It's a case of asking, what is a Labour government able to do? What terrors is a Labour government able to impose on us that a Conservative government still can't quite access?
Well, I think there's a lot in what you say there with regard to both the past and our potential future, because I spoke a while ago now to Dr. Bob Gill, who's a long-time NHS anti-privatisation campaigner, and he said something quite astonishing to me, which I wasn't aware of, which was that the Labour government in 2006 was able to get the agreement of the health service unions to not object to privatisation, either PFI or more direct privatization, contracting out of directly provided clinical services. And that was in return for like some improvements on paying conditions, which I think became so-called agenda for change in the NHS. And that was covered up by nobody talked about that. Not even people on the left were aware of it for many, many years. I only found out about it when I spoke to him. And so when we look to Starmer, I mean, I would argue that we've already started to see some of the things that he might be able to do, which is that I think that, and I'm interested in your take on this, the pressure on the union leaderships to wrap up those strikes that went on for the previous 18 months, especially in the Labour-aligned unions, that seems to have been very intense and successful in wrapping those up before we get to election year. And that, to me, I mean, the work that I've been involved with in other areas underlines the suicidal nature of the trade unionism continuing to be aligned with this party, because if you look at what happened with the CWU, for instance, the Communications Workers Union strike in the Royal Mail, not only did Dave Ward and the other leaders sell a deal to their members which was manifestly inadequate, didn't address any of the fundamental issues that they'd gone on strike over, but they did this in a way that actually alienated their members, caused many to leave the union in disgust. And the heart of it seems to have been the relationship with the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer. And so that, to me, is a huge risk, or one of the huge risks of a Starmer government. Like, he will be able to effectively use that relationship with the trade union leadership to quash and demoralize any trade union level resistance to him, on the grounds that, well, look, the Tories are now led by Suella Braverman, or whoever follows Rishi Sunak. And if she gets in, well, she'll privatize everything really quickly. I'm going to do it slowly, and I'll give you a 1% increase on the way. I mean, your thoughts on that, James?
Yes, if America offers any lesson here, it's that if you don't extract your guarantees from the left face of the capitalist parties before the election, you're not going to get a single thing. And yet our trade unions, our Labour left MPs, our left-wingers in general have largely guarantee that they're going to support Sir Keir no matter what. No one has extracted shit from him. And the difference is that Joe Biden at least has a sort of aesthetic kind of element of his presentation where he claims to be Joe the Labour man. Sir Keir is the opposite. His entire political identity and project, as I said, even when he was a kind of card-carrying, progressive, sort of Ken doll of the left in the 1990s, even then, his whole project was anti-union. And the idea that you're going to get anything out of him as prime minister when you let him act as he does in opposition is just, I mean, I'd like to say it's surprising, but of course it's completely consistent with the way that the official institutional left in Britain has acted for a long time. But the fact that we can tolerate not just the defenestration of some of the most recognizable figures on the UK left. Nobody has done anything about these high-profile, charismatic scalps that Sir Keir has claimed. The preying on some of the most successful local government exercises that we've seen attached to the Labour Party. Jamie Driscoll, the mayor in the north, I forget the name of what is it, North Tyneside mayor. The fact that his candidacy has been removed when he's one of the most kind of impressive examples of what you can achieve in terms of left policies in local government. All of this has been allowed to pass without any complaint or any kind of gesture of resistance. The fact that the Labour Party is basically the spearhead of a whole new style of surveillance in this country. That's the only way I can interpret it. The way that during the Corbyn years, the right-wing Labour machinery normalized spying on members using keyword searches on the social media accounts, first of all, of people likely to vote for Corbyn in 2015 and in 2016 in the second leadership contest. That those techniques were then used to find people who might be saying anti-Semitic things. Let's do a bit of searching for the afternoon and kick out some more left-wingers. The fact that that was then enshrined in the Equality and Human Rights Commission's investigation into Labour, which says that political parties should now be investigating the likes and reposts on social media engaged in by their members. Who would be a member of a political party now when that is the expectation, that your retweets are now fit matter for your membership subs to be spent on surveilling and investigating? This is the behavior of Keir Starmer's party. This is the behavior of the people he chooses to have around him. If this is what he does to the members of his own party, imagine what he's going to do to the country.
Well, I think we can expect an awful lot more of the kind of things that we saw debuting during the COVID era, James, which is the attempt to hound people out of their jobs. I mean, they used to do the old blacklist on militant trade unionists on the quiet. They used to hide it. Now it looks as if it's going to be state policy, basically, out in the open, which is that not if you say the wrong thing on social media and then the state decides it wants to make an issue out of it, it can do. I mean, if you stretched some of the anti-terrorism laws that the Blair government put through, you could probably do that to people now, i.e. endorsing acts of terror can basically mean if you tweeted Free Palestine and a particularly offensive police agency decided that they wanted to go all the way with it, they could tie you up in court for a number of months, potentially, if they wanted to do an aggressive prosecution on you, which is what I think a lot of people missed about reactionary legislation. It's not there to be enacted immediately. Yeah. I mean, they got kind of caught with the COVID stuff because they tried to go for it. It's there as essentially a reserve tool. So when they do need it, they can just dive into everybody's social media accounts and see what protests you've been on, get you fired from your job, get you blacklisted for, shall we say, getting a mortgage or any of the other things that people regard as normal behavior now. And Sir Keir is very much the man to give the British deep state that, isn't he? He's going to be much more effective at it than some rather ham-fisted reactionary like Suella Braverman.
Absolutely right. And really, this is why it's an instructive coincidence that David Cameron walked back into number 10 Downing Street yesterday to be appointed to the cabinet, because it reminds us that, okay, put it this way. Again, let's invoke our nice Labour supporter who will now be very worried that Keir Starmer, because he never opposes the Tories on anything, he's going to continue those awful forms of legislation introduced under Boris Johnson and continued thereafter that protect the police from prosecution, that protect the military from prosecution, that make it much more difficult to protest. All of these authoritarian measures that end our privacy online, the state is allowed to spy on us, and so on. I would say to those nice Labour supporters, don't worry, Keir Starmer's not going to continue those things. He initiated them as Director of Public Prosecutions at the same time that David Cameron was Prime Minister. The record is all there in Oliver Eagleton's book on Starmer, the way that what Cameron wished he could do when faced with all of that social unrest as a result of the cuts and the way that people's living standards absolutely fell through the floor, the way that the very poorest in the country were deliberately made to suffer, all of those new and very urgent and committed protests over student fees and over cuts, all of that stuff, Cameron wanted to clamp down on it harder, and Starmer at the Crown Prosecution Service basically saw it as his job to give Cameron the tools and to initiate the processes whereby it would become easier. And you say that all these measures are preemptive, that when we get new laws against protest, against privacy, against wrongthink, against hate speech, etc., they're being put on the statute books to deal with future protests that the state is anticipating. Keir Starmer was literally saying that. He was saying, look at these anti-cuts protests, look at these riots that are going on. We really need to spruce up the weapons of the state for dealing with this. And every time he had to adjudicate on anything, if it was a normal person walking past an ice cream shop, this is one of the famous examples, during a riot, sees an abandoned ice cream shop, picks up an ice cream cone, licks it and puts it back down, that guy's getting jail time. A kid picks up a water bottle, a bottle of Evian. That kid is being pursued with all of the force of the law. Ordinary people are treated as fair game for the worst that the law can do. People who reveal state abuses, state secrets, like Julian Assange, are pursued with all of the force of the law. Whereas when it comes to agents of the state, when it comes to the police, the military, even Jimmy Savile, okay, Sir Keir says he wasn't in the office that day. Okay, so be it. But his Crown Prosecution Service was invited to pursue Jimmy Savile, the mentor of the present king, best friend to prime ministers and cabinet members, and his Crown Prosecution Service declined to do so. So again and again, it's not the case that Keir Starmer's just too weak and is too scared that if he's anything like Corbyn, he'll be rejected and kicked out. No, he's committed to this stuff. He initiated this stuff. He's been an agent of it on the side of this sort of para-judiciary of the Crown Prosecution Service, and now he's entered democratic politics to take it into the executive.
So the actual picture that emerges there through your article and any further research that people want to do from that, like for instance the Oliver Eagleton book you mentioned, is of a man who has had a dedicated career as a very, very committed reactionary, an ideologically committed reactionary, not an opportunist, because this is plainly who he is and what he actually does believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of the kind of government that he would lead, I mean, you draw upon some comparisons from Europe in your article, James, about Macron, about Meloni. Like, if you look at like what Macron has done, which is instituted incredibly reactionary crackdowns, using a level of police violence that was not even seen at the height of the May '68 student and worker rebellions over 50 years ago now. There were far more people wounded and killed during the Yellow Vest movement in France under Macron than they were under old General de Gaulle. And it seems to me that what we're looking at, like a government of that ilk, led by Sir Keir Starmer, like one that will immediately move much quicker with reactionary legislation with the full intention of using it. He will beef up the police, carrying on from where Braverman has left off. He will give them more impunity, and he may well give them the kind of tools that when Boris Johnson tried to give them, for instance, water cannons as mayor of London, that kind of died a death. I can see Sir Keir being very enthusiastic about that kind of thing, especially if we get to the point where the recession that is hanging over us like a sort of vulture does swoop down, to complete the analogy, and the government is left facing some incredibly turbulent times, given that many millions of people in Britain are already on the edge of poverty. You've got a lot of angry people, more so than you had in 2011 when those riots quickly swept the forces of the state off the streets in places like London. And then you have a man in charge who is probably even more reactionary than Emmanuel Macron in many respects. But I want to get your take on the potentials there, James.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but I think that younger listeners are going to have to make an imaginative jump into what it was like after the 2008 financial crash and after Cameron came in 2010. Part of what was so cloying and depressing in the strongest kind of sense of the term was that you had a government that did not have a mandate for anything. In a strange way, the problem of New Labour was it's been referred to as a weightless hegemony. No, you couldn't find anyone who agreed with it, and yet it had this huge democratic mandate at all times. By contrast, David Cameron came in, became Prime Minister on the basis of the lowest democratic mandate in history. He, despite the fact that, as again our friend Peter Hitchens described at the time, despite the fact that there had been this silent constitutional crisis where suddenly not only does the right-wing media support the Conservative Party, but now the Guardian and the BBC, the left-wing media and the supposedly impartial broadcast media, has sort of given up on its job of making the case, at least for Labour, and has just sort of decided that Cameron's the man, and so they don't mind if Gordon Brown loses, just as they didn't mind Ken Livingstone losing to Boris Johnson, just as they certainly wouldn't mind anyone defeating Jeremy Corbyn later on. There was this way in which all the arms of the ideological apparatus were just holding the door open for Cameron, and yet he didn't have a mandate. He didn't win. He only got to form the majority government that he did by bringing the Liberal Democrats in-house into this coalition, which involved them basically doing almost entirely the opposite of what the nice beardy types and students who had given them the seats that they had. So you had, for the first time in my lifetime, you had a government that did not have a mandate for anything, but that was enacting the most, frankly, revolutionary change. Blair had set the scene for this, had made it possible, but Cameron and Osborne were the ones who did it. And they were, in defiance of all economic logic, all economic experts' opinion, they were, even the Financial Times and the Economist, the kind of courtiers of neoliberalism were saying that these cuts were wrong, yet they were pursuing this extraordinary vandalism on the entirety of the idea that the state was there to do stuff for its citizens. And they were enacting this extraordinary kind of grab raid on actually any sense that we were citizens at all. And that's before we even get into the way in which Cameron was just gagging to continue Blair's foreign policy and managed to do it in Libya with absolutely catastrophic and tragic consequences. So that was the atmosphere of the coalition, and you did see a big uptick in protest and resistance to it. What I would predict for the Starmer supremacy is that we are probably going to see a similar economic situation. We're going to see a similar situation of a government that nobody exactly likes or approves of or wants, but is able to basically do whatever it likes. You can just watch and see all of the institutions and ideological apparatuses swing behind Starmer by this time next year. And well, there is going to be resistance, and maybe we can talk about what form that can take, but it is going to be met with zero tolerance and a new generation, really, of state repression. And unlike in 2010, when we all just had MySpace, we are going to be chronicling all of our sins on all of this digital media, which are just going to be feeding straight into the security state.
Yes, and I do wonder if there's going to be any potential for derailing Sir Keir's coronation. There seems to be a belated sort of rebellion amongst the Labour left at the moment over the Palestine issue. I'm not sure whether that's going to go anywhere or whether Starmer is going to do what it has been rumoured that he wants to do, which is before the next election, deselect almost the entirety of the Corbyn left that remains inside the party. I mean, it would not surprise me in the slightest if he did do that, given the man's history. But so before we get on to potential resistance, James, just want to get your take on is this Palestine rebellion, first of all, is it going to be any kind of major obstacle for Starmer? And secondly, your opinion on is he going to go for it and just push as many of these people out of the party before the next election?
Well, I don't know why he wouldn't, frankly. The opportunity was there when Corbyn was kicked out, in defiance of all natural justice and all sense of reason or decency or even logic. And Starmer saw that he could do that, and nobody in the liberal professional world would say shit. They wouldn't have done it themselves, but they were relieved that somebody had the balls to do it, and they did not care one bit that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission's report on the Labour Party specifically criticised Corbyn for intervening in the disciplinary process in order to not defend his anti-Semitic friends, as it was reported, but to speed up kicking people out who were accused of anti-Semitism, Ken Livingstone included. No one cared that Sir Keir was doing exactly what the EHRC had criticised Corbyn for doing in intervening to kick him out. no one did shit, and no one did shit on the Socialist Campaign Group, the Labour Left, the people who owed their careers in many cases to Corbyn, and no one did shit in the activist left, because after all, we were all paid up lockdowners, and there would be no repeat of what happened in 2016 when there was a huge demonstration outside Parliament to defend Corbyn during the chicken coup. So once Sir Keir has seen that he can do that, and he can make it so that Jeremy Corbyn will not be becoming a beloved public institution, a cuddly figure like Tony Benn ended up as, appearing on Have I Got News for You. When Sir Keir realized that he can permanently demonize and demolish the standing of somebody as considerable as Corbyn, why wouldn't he do it to everybody else? And yeah, the Labour right, the tragedy really is that the Corbyn project had its chance to fulfill its historical destiny and main purpose, which was to get rid of the Labour rights, just the most poisonous, reactionary and bloodthirsty people in the entire country. The Tories do it for their personal enrichment, or for their own advancements. They are venal, greedy people who believe they're entitled to rule. The Labour right are the motivelessly malignant perverts of the country who do it out of spite and do it out of hatred for anyone cool and young, anybody progressive, anybody left-wing, anybody who gets in their way. They only care about control of the Labour Party. There was a chance to get rid of that in 2018, but the trade unions didn't get behind it, and Corbyn himself didn't quite have the stomach for it either. So yeah, the question of whether the Socialist Campaign Group can resist, whether Corbyn himself could head up some resistance, well, they could and he could, but ultimately these people are Labour men and women. Jeremy Corbyn, the supposed career rebel, had a cat called Harold Wilson. He's a Labour man in his heart, and much as I would love and support an independent run by him, much as I would love and support some kind of attempt at a movement, an alternative left base in the country, getting the band back together, I know you'd be very cynical about that. I would very willingly get behind it one more time, but it's not going to happen. So who cares? The Labour left is weak, and nobody has told Starmer that he can't do whatever he wants at the bidding of the spiteful Labour right.
Well, I think that the thing we need to end on perhaps a more positive or constructive note, James. The thing that needs to be left behind is this. Well, it's exactly what you've just said, which is that we are Labour people, and that. I mean, my time in the Labour Party was mercifully brief, about 4 years. So I did meet a lot of these people, though, who were just like, well, I'm Labour, and that's it. There's nothing beyond that. It's I don't like Tories, and you can't have a discussion on the basis of that.
I mean, I said this around the time of the conference. Would it be the 2017 conference when everybody whipped out Palestinian flags, and then in this year's conference there was a standing ovation for Keir or somebody sort of praising Israel's right to defend itself, and the whole place erupted. Now, it's easy to think, oh my God, how far the Labour Party has fallen from its anti-imperialist phase in 2017 to this reactionary Atlanticist project. But I bet about at least 70% of the delegates in that hall were just the same people. Their ideology is Labour.
Yeah, no matter what. And so we need to move beyond that, and I think the Labour Party, my own view is that it needs to be written off as a dead zone now. It's owned by Sir Keir Starmer and his friends, and they are welcome to it. The other problem that we have, and I My time in the trade union movement started under David Cameron, and I was in the civil service, and we all know what was going on in terms of cutbacks there. The problem in the trade unions, I mean, we touched on this earlier, is that the leaders and the permanent bureaucracies that surround them, especially in Unite and Unison and GMB, they are the same as those people in the Labour Party who are just Labour. Many of them have jobs which are directly linked to the Labour Party. Many of them staff the Labour Party bureaucracy from time to time. In fact, some of the worst people I ran into in the Labour Party bureaucracy were from the GMB union. And these people are not dedicated to their members. They're not dedicated to the wider working class. They're dedicated to preserving their own bit of what they call the movement, and that's it. And so any movement of the working class that is going to be built in response to the rule of Keir Starmer or whoever comes after him has to find a way to go around both, I think. We've seen some elements of that, small elements of that, like smaller union experiments from like IWGB and others in like areas of the economy that are ununionized. And I think that that's something which has got to grow because trying to get the unions interested in or doing effectively the job of bringing the unorganized sections of the working class, which is huge, together to just do basic trade unionism. Unite, Unison, GMB are either not interested or not very good at it in the slightest. So those are some areas that I think we've got to look at. And then politically speaking, I mean, there's a lot of talk about broad formations, etc., based around essentially coming together around some sort of basic social democratic program outside of the Labour Party, which I think perhaps many people would be on board with. I'd like your opinion on that. I mean, but the fact is that we've seen where a basic and popular social democratic program goes if you're not prepared to kick back against the people who will emerge as its enemies internally and never mind externally. And they will emerge because but they are just frightened of the opposition of the ruling class and the government, or frightened about their own position, or whether their politics goes that way, that labor right element pops up in any social democratic organization when the going gets tough, so to speak. We saw it in Syriza. You see it to a certain extent in Podemos. You see what happens to the various successor organizations of the Italian Communist Party. When the heat is on, a bunch of people will run away. So, I mean, to conclude my general thought on that, James, like even if it was possible to pull that together as a broad sort of, let's call it a minimum program type organization in the future, it would need to be informed by the experience of the Corbyn period. It would need to be a hell of a lot tougher, and it would need to be driven by a sense of ownership and activism from its base. And I think in the Corbyn period, it was too much the case that too many people younger than you and I joined, but never got active, never did anything, thought that getting the badge was it and voting for Jeremy on polling day was it. So to throw to you for some thoughts on that and concluding thoughts, James.
Yeah, I mean, it is the kind of melancholy shadow that's hung over the last few years, really, that it's not just the failure of Corbynism, it's not just the second referendum position. You know, I've both made versions of this argument many times, but on every salient issue that has come along since, the left in the UK has basically acted from the same first principles that led it to be overwhelmingly temperamentally pro-EU. On lockdown, it basically wanted to trust the expert, having gone from, oh yeah, we've learned that you shouldn't defend the expert class against the people over Europe. We won't do that again. Oh, straight away, here comes lockdown. Nope, you've got to trust the science, you've got to trust the experts, and people are not to be trusted. They're idiots who'll just cough on each other as soon as you let them out of the house. Ukraine comes along, slightly different. At least you can rely on the left, who was led by this great anti-imperialist Jeremy Corbyn, to oppose indiscriminate flooding of Eastern Europe with weapons in the transparent hope of effecting regime change in Russia, which is never going to happen. At least we're going to oppose that. No, the left either wanted to sort of just go on about defending Ukraine, policing its own ranks, kicking out the tankies, even to the point of Andrew Fisher, former Corbyn advisor, suggesting that Stop the War should disband. On every salient issue since Brexit, the left has continued to make the same mistakes. So this is the problem with imagining this kind of alternative base, this project, this mass movement that might spring up to resist Keir. I just wouldn't trust the people who would obviously be leading it, who would the sort of left influencer caste who would get funneled straight into those positions. You saw it in all those projects for resisting energy bills and so on last year. It was all the same faces. God loves so many of them. But there's just no kind of clarity on how we would avoid making these same kind of class-based mistakes. The one turning point, the one kind of grit in this is the response to Gaza, where we are seeing a massive differentiation for the first time between elite opinion, which is in complete agreement in taking the pro-Israel line, and popular opinion. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm going all Arab Spring and techno-optimist here, but I simply think that well, I noticed that it was on Instagram that you were first seeing the indiscriminate posting of absolute astonishing violent images of children being blown to pieces in Gaza. It was on the Normie platform that you saw it first. On Twitter, people were still kind of making arch remarks and so on, but then they gave up in the end. And I saw very clever people finally just posting these images and saying, oh my God, look at this kid. This is so appalling. Everyone has been glued to their phones. Everyone has been totally addicted to this stuff that we're seeing with our own eyes, which is completely in defiance of all of the bullshit that we've been told our entire lives about Israel and what it is and what it does. So lockdown was depressing because everyone was tacitly for it. Ukraine was depressing because there wasn't popular feeling really against arming Ukraine and against NATO. So people of our opinions were kind of in this slightly misanthropic outsider position. This is the first one in a while where there's a massive disconnect between normie opinion and elite opinion. And it's also the first one in a while where the left are the ones getting it right. For God's sake, all of these right-wingers, dissidents, post-left people and so on that we always like to have on our shows and breathe a sigh of relief. I don't have to listen to these left-wing platitudes. I can have an ordinary conversation. Suddenly, the vast majority of those guys have clicked in, the Zionism clicks in, and they're all defending Israel. They're all defending cancel culture against pro-Palestinians, etc. This is the big test. You've got to drop all those people. And the left, okay, we'll see what they do on the next crisis. They're actually like acting in coordination, and they're on the right side of this. And by and large, we're not seeing those habits of self-policing and self-destruction that we've seen on the left for a long time. What that can be used for, what the potentiality of that is, I mean, people were probably saying similar things about Iraq. Your own friend George Galloway basically tried to kind of create a political program out of that popular anti-war feeling around the Iraq war. It's been tried before. It hasn't succeeded before, but that's where the gap is, as far as I can see. And yeah, I mean the sacking of Suella Braverman, the defeat of that kind of bit of Clarkson populism, this kind of racism from above, this attempt to get people stirred up. I preferred it in the Boris years when the villains were Ramonas and civil servants. And yeah, Boris Johnson's project was basically bully civil servants into doing what you want. Now it's so like dull and boring. Oh, it's racism again. You know, most of what Suella Braverman says, you could hear from New Labour Home Secretaries back in the
Oh,
day.
David Blunkett, certainly.
Exactly right. So Suella was only sacked, and the tide has only started to sort of turn in the kind of media representation of pro-Palestinian activism because of the sheer numbers on the streets. If there were fewer people, they could say what they want about us, but there are enough people have seen that shit on Instagram and won't stand for it. That's the first. That's actually in the worst of circumstances. That's the first bit of a hopeful kind of window that I've seen really in a very long time. So you know, Starmer's on the wrong side of that. The chants at the protests, many people have said this to me, are against Rishi Sunak and against Keir Starmer. And well, I'm not going to be too optimistic about it, but that is not uninteresting. Put it that way.
Yes, I think that if nothing else can be achieved before the next election, capitalizing on that kind of impulse has to be a priority, which is that more and more people will look at Keir Starmer and the things that he says and the things that he stands for and see that, oh, it's continuity. Whereas a lot of people, and you touched on this earlier, I can remember the feeling before 1997. I was 15 at the time, so I wasn't really paying that much attention, but there was a successful creation of a general mood of optimism. And the feeling that, well, it's got to be about change, even if, however illusory that was.
Mm-hmm.
As you were saying, this is now, he promises nothing. And not only that, he will double down on the worst elements of the Conservative Party legacy. So, in my view, I mean, the next election, pretty much a lost cause. There's nothing going to come from it that's any good. But the more damage that can be done to Starmer beforehand, the lower his vote is, the weaker his mandate is, the better. And that's probably the only positive thing that I can see coming. A weak Starmer government that cannot do the whole, or kind of implement the whole range of reactionary things that he wants to do, is better than a stronger one or a continuing Sunak administration with more strength behind it.
Absolutely agree.
Right, and on that point of convergence, James, we will call it a night, and I would recommend that everybody go and read James's article entitled Keir Starmer, the World's Most Typical Poll, and that's in Compact Magazine on the website at the moment. James, where can people find you if they want to find more about your work and The Popular Show?
Well, I hope listeners to your platform will like The Popular Show too. I know we've already got a lot of crossover, but get us on X at The Popular Pod. Find us on patreon.com/The Popular Show, or The Popular Show on all the normal podcast platforms. That's the place to go.
All right. Thank you, James A. Smith. And we'll be talking to you again undoubtedly in the future.
See you soon, Alexander.